And I also post a message for everyone to know that it is a recorded session. And now it's 6, so I think why don't we just start?
Okay, good morning, good day, good afternoon, whatever it is in your time zone, and welcome to the 7th German Aerospace Research Society European Aviation Conference panel discussion on COVID. This is one of a series of panel discussions online, and we will be picking up again in September, so there will be more to come. Today's topic is to look at COVID's impact on the sector and what it means for climate policy in aviation and environmental policy more generally. We've got an hour and a half together this morning, or it's this morning in Paris where I am, and we will run this as with a panel discussion at the beginning and then open it out to everybody to comment and ask questions through the chat function that's available in the box that opens when you float towards the bottom of the page on your screen. So if you'd like to intervene at any point, please do use the chat function to put questions to the panel, and then I will ask those questions to the panelists, and then we'll use the same function for an open discussion at the end of the session. Now, the one thing that I like very much about these European Aviation Conference discussions is that they are at the same time very frank and very amicable, and with a good mix of people from industry as well as from academia. And I'm sure that'll be the case today. So I'd like to introduce our speakers. I'm Stephen Perkins from the International Transport Forum at the OECD, chairing today. And our speakers are first Bill Hemmings from Rosetta Advisory, formerly the aviation specialist for transport and environment, based in Brussels. Then we were to have Dan Elliott from Frontier Economics. Very unfortunately, Dan has a health issue that prevents him participating today, but fortunately I can report that it's not COVID-19. Then Peter Forsyth from Monash University, who can very competently cover the economic perspectives as well as what we asked him to talk about, which was balancing intervention from the climate and economic perspectives. And then Pieter Cornelisse from KLM has very kindly agreed to be our lead discussant. And then we'll open the discussion to all. And assuming that we keep on time, we'll be able to take some questions directly to the speakers after each of the two main presentations. So a reminder to use the Q&A box, well, in fact, the chat box throughout. And just a few words of introduction to the issue at stake before we hand over to Bill for the first presentation. Well, COVID-19 has provoked a very major economic crisis, which is very different from economic crises that we've had before, apart from major wars, potentially much bigger too, because it's created by government actively depressing economic activity. And that has affected aviation more than most other sectors. And as we come out of confinement, recovery is really a case of standing on the brake and the accelerator in terms of government intervention at the same time, especially in aviation, with additional restrictions that are going to be maintained, it seems, for some time, as other parts of the economy are completely opened up. So all in all, aviation is one of the sectors worst hit, and intervention to mitigate job losses is vital. But the scale of the intervention is huge, completely unprecedented. And the question is, what form should that intervention take, and what does it mean for environmental policies? Should the environment, its targets and regulation, however soft those may be, should they be relaxed, pushed back, postponed, put into the background? Or is climate still the priority that it was a year ago? We have other concerns also, long-term concerns for the sector, to make it as liberal with as much competition as feasible, to ensure that the consumers are the people that benefit from the sector to the maximum. So can the stimulus programs that the governments have announced and the way the sector is rebooted, can that be designed to respect both of these environmental and economic goals for the sector as we go forward, or will there be sacrifices? So with that short introduction, I'd like to hand the floor over to Bill to share his screen and take us through his presentation.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Stephen. Can you see the screen?
Yes, it's working fine. Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you. Let's get cracking. If I can find the advance.
Probably if you just press page down on your keyboard, it will work.
That's what I tried. So that's where we were at the beginning of this year, and the top line is aviation. This is emissions of all transport sectors in Europe. That's a longer term perspective back to 1990. Economy-wide emissions in Europe compared to aviation, and on the right, just to note that. Even before Kyoto, some venerable organizations were proposing that there be a levy or a tax on fuel just between Annex I countries, and of course that didn't happen. There again is the situation as it was at the end of last year. All the other sectors coming down and aviation emissions predicted to continue going up. So where are we? Having also been in the industry, both the aviation industry and the corporate travel management industry, I'd be the last to say that this isn't the most catastrophic crisis that has ever faced aviation in its commercial aviation in its history, and I don't think any of us know fully, certainly, how to handle such a crisis, and none of us still really know what's going to happen to the future. At the same time, climate change has not gone away. CO2 has come down dramatically, and non-CO2, which is even more important, has come down even more dramatically. So in that slump of traffic and revenues, ETS costs in Europe for aviation, for airlines, have come down. As far as I'm aware, and this was in a webinar on air traffic management a couple of weeks ago, a lot of charges have been delayed or forgiven. For how long? It's pretty clear to me, and I think to others, that domestic, and in this case, intra-EU domestic, it's recovering first in China, in the United States, in Japan, because they're all large domestic markets, and that is starting to happen now that the Schengen has reopened. International long-haul traffic, who really knows? And that's a shifting issue virtually every day. So it's clear that nation states are doing the regulating and the bailing out today. Historically, the emission split between international and domestic was 60-40. It's now 10-90. In that respect, in my view, ICAO is pretty much a bystander. They have been tracking pandemics for the last 15 years, interestingly, and there's some websites quite hidden that they're on that. And we'll talk a bit later, CORSIA is on the ice. So there are regulators in Brussels busily working on SAF proposals, on revising the Energy Tax Directive, and as we saw earlier this week, on an initial impact assessment on the CORSIA ETS review. There are, however, few environmental conditions on bailouts being put forward. I happen to have joined the industry, Cathay Pacific Airways, a lifetime ago. It was great then. It was easy to make money. I then spent a time as cafe manager first in Amsterdam for Benelux and then in Germany. And this was just before deregulation. And we all know then that regulated fares, I can't say that it was an easy job, but what's clearly happened since deregulation, and this is not me, this is IATA and OAG saying fares have come down pretty well 70%. And you can look it up on IATA that the profit per passenger of typically any European large carrier or indeed global is, if you're lucky, it's a cup of coffee. And the tax take on all this over the past 20 years as deregulation has happened, it's been almost zero. There's been no fuel tax applied in Europe, no VAT, and on the other hand, there've been rather generous and uncontrolled dollops of state aid. You don't need to take that from me. You can take that from the chief executives of airlines like Lufthansa, KLM, and others. The industry talks about the wider economic benefits of aviation, and of course there are. I come from Australia, and I'll be the last one to say that traveling at the very least to see my family once a year, but in terms of business, but Peter will, I'm sure, talk about that more. Again, it's not me, it's IATA and OVID and OAG saying that really COVID has exposed that probably only 30 carriers had really a viable business model. So my point, one of my points today is, I mean, forget about climate regulation. Is it not first and foremost a business model issue for the aviation industry? And having worked for a travel management company on the supplier relations side, and then set up a travel procurement company in Europe, and then worked for American Express corporate business travel across Europe, I know very clearly that corporates are part of the problem because they have enormous pressure on carriers. For corporates, business travel is 1 or 2% of overall costs. For airlines, business travel revenue can be anywhere between 30 and 50% of their costs, and there's an enormous imbalance there. Post-COVID, Pieter Cornelisse will know better than me, but I would have thought that lending is going to be much more difficult to fund individual carriers in their recovery. Fares are going up. They may start low, quick at the beginning, and growth is going to be much more constrained than it has been in the past. We talked about the share of business travel. And having worked for an environmental organization here for about 10 years, the argument should be, are external costs really any different to operational costs, paying for the crew, paying for fuel? Seems to me that in all this catastrophe that's befallen the industry, isn't it also a time to look at reform? I won't go through this, but I've tried to show on the side, and this comes from a study on aviation taxation fuel in Europe that's just been published by my previous organization, that there's a big free ride on taxation. Don't just take it from me, take it from the study which DG Move commissioned and was published by CE Delft and SEO a year ago. I'm sure we'll discuss about this. I've tried to put on the side, I was never in revenue management. I've tried to put on the side what I think would be the financials of a Ryanair passenger. I do know that the average sector revenue for Ryanair is something around 50 euros a passenger, and there I've listed. And so the conclusion at the bottom is that if you add in just the unpaid fuel tax, the unpaid VAT, and if you ask Ryanair and other low-cost carriers, etc., to refund the state aid, I've put it at 5 euros a passenger, who knows what it really is, then there are airlines in Europe and elsewhere which are heavily underwater before you even start to pay for crew, operations, aircraft, etc. Can that really, and should that really continue after this situation that we face now? So my proposition, industry to look at a better, more viable financial business model, even just forgetting climate. It's going to be a smaller, and it should be a more profitable industry. It's hardly profitable now. And it's going to have to take account of health, find the reset button, and slowly build in external costs within a new pricing infrastructure. If you don't start now, the recovery, when the recovery's arrived, it's, to me, I think, too late. So what I'll try and talk about is what measures And a lot of them, I think, are actually independent of what is happening to the industry now, certainly in terms of what regulators should do, but also, I think, in terms of what airlines should do. I won't dwell too much on ICAO, since I've spent 11 years attending it and observing it and tearing my grey hair out. I don't believe that the CO2 standard had achieved anywhere near what it was supposed to. Its technology level is TRL8 in 2016. For in-production aircraft, and it's mainly in-production aircraft which get renewed, whether NEOs or MAXs, whatever, because the enormous costs of a new aircraft type is 15, 20 billion, who knows what, and it would take at least 10 years. The production cutoff has been delayed to another 8 years. And so there's nothing really that the ICAO standard can do to incentivize cleaner, more fuel-efficient aircraft. Unfortunately, when the EASA basic regulation was revised a couple of years ago, once again, European member states tied Europe's hands. Europe cannot do its own regulation on standards if there is an ICAO standard already covering that. And Europe is the only country in the world which ties its hands. That certainly the United States has full liberty to do what it likes with fuel and efficiency standards if it wants to. The long-term goal discussion has been going round and round in ICAO for 10 years. It's a game of kicking the can. So now, for good or ill, and it is really for ill, that the baseline, of course, has been changed. I don't know. Some people say it'll be back to usual international traffic by 2023. I think every day we see further bad news, and it could well be 25. So maybe the first two phases, voluntary phases of CORSIA, actually require no offsetting. So it becomes a data collection exercise. The data is owned by ICAO states, and there's no provision to share it. So how helpful is that? It's not even clear yet who will be participating, and even after 2021, I'm not sure it's going to be clear who's participating. So pre-COVID, you can see the graph on the back. CORSIA was only ever going to cover 6% of the emissions from 2015 to 2050. Who knows what it's going to be now, but I don't think it's going to be much of a larger percentage. There's still work to do, and if people want to continue working on CORSIA, there's a list of the issues which remain outstanding. I'm sorry, but that's my view, unfortunately, of what should be a real action at the international level. But you can't have international action at the international level if you don't have leaders. And unfortunately, certainly in Europe and in the United States, my home country, Australia, and other countries in the Annex 1 have not led in any way they should. So let's just go quickly through some of the likely issues which regulators should think about. I won't go through all of these, you can read them. There is no carbon leakage. There might have been, which is why free allowances were dreamed up in 2010 for a start of the entire ETS for covering all flights out of Europe. So if the Commission now wants to phase out free allowances, I don't really understand why it needs to be take such a long time. The impact of the free allowances is not on stringency, it's only any possible impact on a price effect on tickets, and it's not clear what that would be. The initial impact assessment, which the Commission came out with a couple of days ago, in effect is a sad but realistic acknowledgement that there's been a long-term policy failure in Europe on regulating aviation emissions, not just the ETS, but everything. Remember that after Brexit, the EU ETS for 27 countries is 31% smaller than what it is with the UK in there. So it's a measure which will shrink by 31%, and it will stay 31% smaller if Boris doesn't have an ETS. And since he's likely to crash out of the European Union, can we rely upon the United Kingdom to implement its own aviation ETS and link it? Those issues I don't think COVID has any impact on what regulators and member states needs to do. Fuel taxation, which is something I've been working on recently. Before 2003, you would go to prison in Europe if you tried to tax aviation fuel, which is a rather odd situation to be. Bravo, the Netherlands, they had some domestic fuel taxation while they had domestic flights in the Netherlands. They've gone. Norway has been doing it since 1999, as does some of the flights, not all of them, between Zurich and Geneva. You could tax fuel bilaterally since 2003, when the Energy Tax Directive was revised. No one's taken it up, and the Commission sat on its hands. Will the Green Deal remove the energy tax exemptions? One should hope so, but it looks like the unanimity rule will still be there. Read the study that's recently been published. It will go into all the gory history and the fact that if Spain and Ireland hadn't vetoed, we would actually probably have a mandatory fuel taxation already. Remember that there are a lot of also-rans in Europe, and the emissions and fuel burn figures that you'll see in the study have never been made public by anyone ever before, and I don't even believe that the Commission, ECOFIN, or anyone else really knew what the situation was when they rightly decided at the end of last year to revise the directive. The top 6 countries there account for 72% of intra-EU fuel burn. And there are only 4 or 5 countries who actually have substantial domestic emissions. Probably 23 or 24 European countries have virtually no domestic emissions. So it's really a question of what you do intra-EU on fuel taxation. With Brexit, the United Kingdom becomes a 3rd country. Should Boris be given a freebie on fuel taxation, or should Europe not say that you know, there are a whole series of environmental equivalence issues around Brexit, and isn't Europe's right to preserve the right to tax fuel if it wants to imperative in any Brexit deal which is likely to be put together at the last minute later this year? And I would argue, Pieter Cornelisse and KLM and others, that this is actually a very critical competitive issue for carriers. And I would hope, since you know very well how to chew the ear of regulators in Brussels, that you would chew it very hard on this issue. Of course, we want clean fuel mandates on all outbound flights. And of course, we need incentives and R&D for them. But should they be all given as free handouts? To me, and I think to a lot of others, that clean fuel development is going to require government intervention, but it should go hand in hand with carbon pricing. After all, if demand actually recovers, and to the same extent of growth in the past, don't you want carbon pricing to temper that level of growth? Otherwise, if it's unconstrained growth, you've just got to produce more SAF, which is more expensive to get in the direction that you want to. Earmarking, I would prefer it. It's not up to me, neither is it up to industry. It's up to governments, but people can talk to governments. I have to say, bravo, coming from American Express and coming from corporate travel, that what KLM is doing to try and get corporates involved in all of this is with contracts, their corporate contracts, is fantastic. What else can you do? And airport charges, they're capped, I'm not sure. Has LTO NOx charges changed much? Noise charges have funded double glazing, but in fact, you know, the ICAO noise standards, their technology following, and you look, all the new aircraft are streets ahead of the Chapter 14 stringency. Sadly, on the soot NVPM standard that ICAO finished a couple of years ago, and that if it was properly done, it would be very expensive for engine manufacturers, could have an impact on soot at altitude and therefore on non-CO2 effects. But unfortunately, European member states, as they did with the CO2 standard, dumbed it down in order to protect certain engine manufacturers. Other measures, non-CO2, it's been out there for 25 years. It's like waiting for Godot. Aviation-induced contrails are 60% of aviation's climate impact, so why wouldn't you look at contrail avoidance? And the people in the United Kingdom on Greener by Design have been ignored by EASA in the work that's been done. So the Commission is now to report in the summer. I believe the services are fighting amongst each other about what they're going to say, but we need to look at that very carefully. Phasing out old aircraft, it's been tried before. They are being phased out. I'm not sure. We can talk about what measures could be done and should they be paid by taxpayers to do that. Would national carriers like France to have a phase out regulation, another one in Holland, another one in Germany, etc.? Or just, as the way I read the industry, you just want cash for clunkers for free. On modal shift, very interesting development now with the French DGCA. The background being that already domestic flights are suffering well before COVID. And so now this EC regulation, which has been there for 12 years, ignored and unknown, is now going to be used to start requiring all flights under 2.5 hours, if it's possible by train in that time, to shift to rail. There are some wrinkles around that, but it's something that we should encourage. You can withdraw traffic rights for up to 3 years if there's an okay environmental alternative. The Austrian government instead has tried to put a short-haul kilometre ticket tax. I think that way it may well be illegal. Ryanair was caught Dublin out doing this 10 years ago, and there's a CE Delft study for transport and environment on the website that you can read about that. So should we have bailouts and wait? Why should we waste a crisis, the mother of all crises? Reinvent your business models. Phase in measures contingent on traffic recovery. We already heard on the ATM webinar that if they're going to reform ATM in Europe, do it now. Don't wait till the skies are full again. Same with the business model. Same for carbon pricing. If it's good enough to have a farm to fork strategy from the Green Deal for agriculture, why not shouldn't the Commission and member states come out with a proactive approach to cover all these issues? Take the non-CO2 report seriously when it comes to Parliament in the next 2 months. Factor in non-CO2 in mitigation plans. At least start some trials on contrail avoidance. The Brits and others who are on this call are ready to do that. They're just waiting for the go. Guidelines on bilateral fuel taxation. We've been waiting 17 years. Part 2. So let's just not have the French DGCA implementing 18808, 208. What's the problem with Germany doing that? What's the problem with shifting to rail, Amsterdam, Brussels, and when that's working? And I see Eurostar, they've taken about a year to sort out the customs issues. There's no reason why Amsterdam to Paris can't be replaced by trains as well, as long as the slots don't then go to long haul. Of course, we have to accelerate work on the PTL mandates. Why shouldn't some in government, you're going to need government incentives, why shouldn't they be reimbursed from carbon pricing, whether directly or indirectly? Expand KLM's fantastic program and hold corporates responsible for their emissions. There are many free riders on the climate, and you could argue that we're all the free riders because we all want cheap tickets and corporates want cheap tickets. And that's the bane of every airline revenue management's life, that there's enormous pressure for cheap, cheap, cheap. Is that the way we want to see the aviation industry post-COVID? Long-haul emissions are nearly 2/3 of EU outbound emissions. Seriously, is CORSIA, which is on ice, going to regulate long-haul emissions? Maybe in 10 or 15 years, when we can get a decent fuel mandate, then that could start to impact all carriers departing flights from Europe. But do we wait for 15 years? The only instrument that I can see in the meantime are ticket taxes, and the Brits started that in 1993. But remember, Trumpland has had both an arrival and a departure passenger tax on passengers for, I don't know, 20, 30 years. Ticket taxes are very common around the world. And even in the Netherlands now, the Rutte government is going to put a per-flight tax on freighters. When to do it? The regulatory work is overdue. agree on the measures. They can't come in overnight at the maximum, but why not have some sort of staged mechanism where as traffic recovers, and OEG is pretty good at measuring how traffic is recovering, then you start to implement at different phases. And why not have an intelligent discussion with everybody around an approach like that? But most of what I argue for doesn't have to wait. Restructuring financials, modal shift. PSO rules are going to be revised also in the 1008-2008 review. Why is it that in theory you can have a PSO going from one remote airport to another airport? In the United States, they do subsidize regional airports and traffic, but it must connect to a hub. Why, in the very least, wouldn't Europe want it to connect to a hub? And I would be pretty sure that most of the hub carriers would say that makes common sense. So it's up to you guys and gals to actually push that issue. Abolish the low-cost carrier state aid rorts. You don't need to listen to me. You can listen to the chief executives of any number of carriers around Europe. It's taken a long time to agree to the RED II sustainability criteria such as they are, and there's a lot of tiredness in the Commission, but someone has to push the Commission now to agree on additional sustainability criteria for clean fuels and especially PTL. We need to start building the PTL industry now, and corporates need to help fund it. Interestingly, on the initial impact assessment, there is a proposal. Someone came up with it 2 years ago, in fact. We're going to keep CORSIA out of intra-EU. Foreign carriers within the EU are now 1.2% of traffic. There's no need at all to have double regulation within the intra-EU. What you do about extra EU, we can leave that to the co-decision. And the Commission needs to do guidelines on restructuring passenger taxes. They certainly need restructuring, and on bilateral taxation. And just the last thing, I opened Lloyd's list this morning and see, you know, the IMO is at it again, not on targets, but they've been at it now for 3 years on measures. You know, here is the International Chamber of Shipping rather ingenuously saying, oh, we've got to have measures. Of course, are they good measures? And you set that against the letter which the aviation industry wrote to Brussels a week or so. It has to be more, in my view, than about handouts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Bill. That was very complete and very stimulating. And I think one thing that's important maybe to start thinking about is viewing fuel taxation as something that facilitates all the other things that we're trying to do to intervene, rather than being a problematic measure. It's something that makes everything else much more feasible, much more doable. I don't know if that'll stimulate any more responses from the participants. We've had only just one question raised so far. Bill, I can put it to you, but everybody might want to reflect on it. That is, there was another seminar in this series yesterday afternoon on aviation and tourism and the recovery after COVID. And there was apparently a consensus that tourists, consumers, were going to be demanding a much greener aviation industry to serve at least tourism, and they would be part of the picture in driving improved environmental regulation. And the question is, what do you think?
Well, I think they're late to the day, and there are all sorts of conflicting issues around that, because a lot of tourism is long haul, and there are some economies which are incredibly dependent upon long haul tourism. And there is certainly an argument developing about climate justice from the south. That I mean, this goes to the heart of the ICAO regulations. You know, you and I, we've all consumed enormous carbon budgets, me in particular. And do we have the right to say that travelers in South Asia or Latin America don't have a right to do that? It's a very tricky issue, but certainly I think there's no doubt that tourism, and particularly long-haul tourism, has to be part of the discussion and has to be part of a solution.
Right, and another question has come in, and one that I had in the back of my mind before we started this is, I don't know if you've all seen the Stiglitz et al. Paper that's about to be published, but has been circulated in preprint, that looks at assistance measures across the economy and categorizes them according to how effective they are and also how negative they are for the environment, particularly CO2. And intervention for recovery in aviation comes out the least effective in terms of protecting livelihoods and the most destructive in terms of potential environmental effects. And would you care to comment on that?
Well, I think there are two elements to bailout. There are people's livelihoods and jobs. And if there's no reason why those jobs and livelihoods for people who work in the airline industry they're no less important livelihoods than people in other industries, right? And so there's an argument that all individuals need to be rescued. The question to me is that the part of the bailout which goes to airline management and talks to their future business model is certainly something that we should be talking about, and there has been virtually no discussion of that as far as I can see.
Yeah, this COVID crisis has really revealed the problems everywhere in the economy and also in the organization of government, things that have been dysfunctional and failed to be addressed for many years. So I think you're right that it is an opportunity to take a good look at the business models. Up to now, I think many of us assumed that CORSIA is the only game in town for reforming at least the international emissions. But perhaps we've been too blinkered and sucked into only looking down one avenue. Obviously, you think that, so you don't need to comment.
You saw my slide about the building, right?
Indeed.
Say no more. I mean, you can easily slag off at international, and one shouldn't. Of course, this is a global problem, but first and foremost, it's been an Annex 1 problem, and Annex 1 countries from Kyoto and onwards have failed miserably in their responsibilities. And we've all failed miserably, and we've all continued to develop large carbon footprints. And now it's all catching up with us. But isn't it now? I mean, this is an awful catastrophic time. But in fact, the fact that things have slowed to what they have done do we want another time like this to actually reset the button? Maybe in some respect, this is a godsend what's happened in terms of trying to get things better in the future now.
Well, that would be extremely useful if that's what it turns out to be. I'd like at the end of the session to come back to talk a bit about what could be done within the CORSIA framework, or maybe what we should focus on there, and also the modal shift potential, the potential for intervention to push more modal shift to rail. But to keep on time, I'd like first to take Peter's presentation. If you can share your screen, Pieter, and take over the proceedings. And you'll need to unmute yourself as well. So it's yes, Pieter Forsyth first. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Good.
You just need to share your screen. That's working nicely too.
Good. So I've now just got to somehow or other move the screen. Start. Good. Okay then. So thanks very much. And what I'll be trying to do for a few minutes here is look at how, I can get this going, what impacts the crisis is having on aviation and aviation policies towards climate change. I'll just say climate change generally. Okay. Now, some people have been saying it's a great opportunity to implement green policies. And indeed, quite recently, there was a statement from a number of bodies, including IATA and Airlines for Europe, etc., and so on, saying there are all sorts of great opportunities Now, I question this. So far as I can see, one of the key things that COVID has done is it's creating a cash and viability crisis for airlines and a government debt and deficit problem. So it's never really quite explained why it is that it's going to be really great for policies towards climate change. If anything, be the reverse, though there are some different aspects to all of this. Okay, so let's just have a quick look at the impacts of COVID-19. So we're all, I think, pretty familiar with the impact on demand. We also are aware of the implications for fleets, and perhaps a bit less aware that the emissions per passenger kilometre can be lower as a result of airlines moving towards their new airliners rather than using their old ones. And we're also a bit aware of fuel prices overall in, particularly oil prices and aviation fuel prices. So that's one sort of aspect or impact. Another one is the impact on finances of airlines, other aviation players, and also on governments. I won't say anything much about that at the moment, but I'll mention the third aspect, which is on policies and regulation. And there are some effects. And I think one of the most notable one, which is what we've just been discussing a moment ago, is that on CORSIA. That once upon a time, CORSIA was all set to go and it was all worked out. But then as a result of the crisis and the fall in airline demand, his whole sort of mantra has been changed, or not, at least for the time being. Other things haven't been changed that much, such as the EU ETS, and there are implications for airline subsidies towards airlines and also taxes. In a moment, airlines are less able to pay and governments are more keen to levy to get more resources. However, one of the things that is really important, I think, is that there is a financial crisis. And there is a financial crisis from the part of the airlines, who are having basically cash problems in the moment, and then moving on to more viability problems in the longer term. And then, of course, with the governments, there are deficit problems and debt problems, and therefore that's affecting their behaviour. So what do I think what can we hope for? What's the best we can hope for? What I think we can hope for is continued progress on good, well-articulated, well-evaluated policies. That can still happen. And I think we can also hope that there will be avoidance of poor or opportunistic policies. Of course, what may happen, of course, the governments may put available some recovery funds, but they might put them in, make various conditions upon them, and some of these conditions may not make sense. They might be very good or they might be very bad, who knows. Anyway, okay, so getting that, let's just move on to the next slide, which is trade-offs. Of course, as soon as you get an economist, you get an economist talking about trade-offs. What I think we've got is we still have a trade-off between green things and other things. Suppose that there are some recovery funds available. Okay, what's needed now? Well, one thing that you could get would be assistance for airlines to survive. Or alternatively, you could have the money being spent on more longer run, say, green initiatives, such as funds for R&D into sustainable fuels. Now, in this sort of environment, which would be chosen? It's an awkward trade-off. Green policies have a cost. We'd like to see them, but they can be quite expensive. And so it may, particularly in the current environment, there may be pressure, strong pressure, to say, well, let's get the money, take the money and run. Another thing that we need to recognise is that there is quite a great opportunity for poor policies. And I think this is already happening. People have all sorts of barrows that they're now trying to push. For example, bans on short-haul air transport. It's not to say that short-haul air transport may be fairly emissions intensive, but you need to have a more overall perspective on this. And if we're going to have, let's say, a fuel tax, that should capture that. You don't have to do it twice. Bans on new runway investment, or allocating slots on the basis of sustainable fuel use. Or one that was put forward by IATA and A4E recently is subsidies for European airlines to buy new low emissions aircraft. Well, that sounds great, except this is only Europe. What do? Do they sell the gas guzzlers to the Americas? I mean, that seems pretty likely to me, unless you actually scrap the aircraft, or perhaps turn, say the A380s into theme parks or something. You really do have to get rid of the gas guzzlers, not just flick them off to some other country or area. Okay, so let's have a look at just a couple of options, sort of looking at what they look like. These are just sort of a couple that are just come into mind. No particular, well, some of them have been suggested, but so one option that we can think about now is to have green policies, but ones that are costly to airlines. So, for example, you could have a fuel tax to fund R&D on sustainable fuels. Now, that may be, in the long run, a good policy, but it certainly would hit the airlines hard at the moment. So, ideally, we'd prefer to have some policies that are, shall we say, are easier on the airlines at this moment. Now, one thing, of course, you can do is say, well, okay, in the longer run, maybe when aviation has recovered a lot, we could develop a policy starting from now to operate once the crisis is over. Now, if this has been credibly implemented, and that, of course, is a big if, this would actually have a good effect in giving airlines an incentive to reduce emissions, not just when it's imposed, but from now on, because they have to plan for, let's say, a new fuel tax and so on. Okay, so that's costly to the airlines. Can you have some policies that can be good for the airlines, make it easy for them? Well, one possibility, and I'm sure that Bill would be very keen on, is that you could have a policy of reducing air transport and indeed other ETS allowances, less available, which of course pushes up the price, but in the same time give more away. So this would have the effect of reducing emissions, but of course it will make it more but it would be good for the airlines. They would be able to profit from it. Now, you don't necessarily have to do this forever, but that might be a way of helping airlines if that's what you want to do. Now, of course, as we know, there's always a catch. Emissions are reduced, airlines do quite well, but of course, passengers would be paying, maybe other industries as well. But those are things that can be thought about. Okay. So let's just sort of sum up then what I've been, some of the ideas I've been sort of throwing around. What about COVID-19? Does it make a big difference to aviation climate change policies as being implemented or being considered? And my guess is not very much. Yes, there are some aspects, so things that have been greatly affected. CORSIA being the classic case. But to sum up with, much of what was desirable before COVID-19 still is desirable. And what was not desirable is still not desirable. I think that in the main, the biggest impact perhaps of COVID-19 has been the financial effect on airlines and governments. And this in turn will affect climate change policies and what's feasible and what's not. So thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And a follow-up question from Nilu Sitaram. Could you identify your top opportunistic policies?
I think bans on short distance aviation, I think would be certainly one of them. Oh, and another one would be bans on airport development.
Well, so we continue this gung-ho government intervention in telling us what we can and can't do and what the economy can and can't do. I mean, I must say I've been a bit disturbed by the scale of government intervention and its letting go of all the restraints that used to characterize it. But that's fairly drastic intervention.
Yes, I agree. I mean, well, what we've been seeing is that governments have been doing things very, very differently. Not always the case. So, for example, there has been some support for the airlines in Australia, but in the main, they've been, well, they'll be particularly the regional airlines, but the trunk airlines really haven't been given much support, and they've been more or less told, including one that was on the brink of bankruptcy, to just get on with it, as it were. Even though they're basically their business has more or less been developed, has more or less disappeared, apart from about 5% of it.
Yeah, it does raise the question whether an outright ban is something that industry would find more difficult than an economic instrument like a carbon tax, which faces a lot of resistance in any case. But yeah, we have one other specific point that's being raised by Paul Peters on electrofuels, so power to liquid fuels are, according to another recent GARS seminar, available now rapidly. So why would we want to mandate them gradually rather than straight away? And that maybe, Bill, you want to come in on that as well. But Peter, you can go first since it was a question was stimulated by your presentation.
Well, as far as I mean, the more that new ideas come and are able to be done in a cost-effective way, that's great. Now, I'm not really an expert on what's what's really feasible at the moment and what's not, and what the possibilities really are. But all that I've read suggests that it's taking quite a well. Whatever is available at the moment is still quite expensive, and of course things may change. They could change quite dramatically, but that's possible. But in the meantime, it is rather difficult to get some of these new technologies to be able to be dropped in quite easily into for the airline. So
it's a question of cost effectiveness. Bill, did you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'd just say, I mean, the experience of biofuels after the 10 years for aviation and all the work that's been done shows that without some sort of an intervention mechanism, it ain't going to happen. There may be some limited potential for good alternative fuels from wastes and residues, but if we believe, and certainly Germany believes, and other countries, I think Holland, the Netherlands as well, and others, and we have some mandates already starting, small mandates in some of the European countries. I'm not a philosopher, but Rome wasn't built in a day. And if we don't start building this industry now, and it will take at least 10 years to develop it, then those 10 years are wasted. And so there's going to have to be both government intervention, but as I said before, I don't really see why the user pay, if not the polluter pay principle, doesn't apply. Why should people who are retired and have their pensions taxed pay for the corporate travelers who travel all day long?
Yeah, certification of all sustainable fuels is critical if we're not to go down the road of the biofuel mandates for road transport, which proved pretty disastrous. We've got a follow-up question on what would be the best instrument to push power to liquid production.
I was just about to answer. I mean, my old organization is working on this along with a lot of others, and the suggestion may be that contracts for difference are the way to go. That's a pretty it's a pretty complicated discussion amongst a small group of experts, but it really needs to be discussed seriously now. And the Commission and the various parts of the Commission really need to get their act together and talk to industry and talk to the green industry, hydrogen industry. How are we going to do this, and what is the best way? Because there's overload after RED 2, and there's a disinclination, I think, to really start talking seriously about which, is it a mandate on suppliers? It certainly shouldn't be a mandate, I think, on airlines. It should be on suppliers. But what sort of a mandate? That's critical.
Could I just come in just briefly? I think we should think about, well, we shouldn't be thinking of simply this policy or that policy or anything else policy. We should try to get policies that we think are good policies and will work. So that, for example, the ETS is, many regard it as being overall a good policy. I would agree with that. But we need to have policy. What we have to do is have a suite of policies, all of which make sense. And so what we might have is a fuel tax, particularly for, let's say, intra-regional aviation, including domestic and international. Ideally, you might have it for continental, but that has all sorts of difficulties. So you might have a ticket tax, which I think is a somewhat less effective and efficient mechanism. But you have that, plus something else, and so on, which has the effect of making it more and more attractive to try these new techniques. Don't forget that the ETS has an incentive effectively to save fuel. A fuel tax has an incentive to save fuel, and so on. Each of these makes it more profitable for airlines to switch towards or try some of these new fuels.
Yeah,
okay, there may be some more needs to be done, but nonetheless, that's getting towards that is a good idea, I think.
Yeah, it's an interesting way to look at development going forward. The one concern is governments getting attached to the instruments they introduce as a preliminary temporary step. APD in the UK, it's something that the government is certainly not interested in giving up for some better alternative. So it's like subsidy addiction on the industry side, you get revenue addiction on the government side. So it's not so easy to have a path. I think Akim Chen, you've got an interesting question. You also have power of the microphone, so why don't you just intervene directly?
Yes, I mean, very often when we have all these GARS, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. Very often, I mean, we're having different topics that we cover at the GARS events. And of course, now everything is dominated by the COVID, but COVID is, at some time it's going to go away. And then we are talking about the old stuff again. And the old stuff includes airline competition, maybe market entry barriers by airport slots, which lead to reduced competition, maybe some strategic actions by full service airlines with respect to low cost airlines, airport market power and the need for regulation, and how privatization may lead to excessive airport charges. And then I wonder, and then we talk about this and I say, this leads to some markups, right? And the markups are there. There are some premiums on the prices. And, if I do some, analysis on for instance, on congestion problems, then I will wonder, okay, so maybe the market congestion problems are very similar to environmental problems because they're externalities and so on and so forth. So, and then it happens, at least the theoretical analysis sort of indicates that it's not clear whether at the end of the day, actually the markups may be just right in order to internalize, all kinds of externalities. So the question is it really true that we have too much air traffic, sort of, because we have a reason to believe that in the normal conditions, various, players along the supply chain in aviation do possess some market power. So there are some markups, and then and of course there are environmental issues. But at the end of the day, the question is, do we really end up with too much air traffic or perhaps not enough air traffic? So that would be my question. What do you think about this?
Okay, well, just a quick response to that. Yes, in principle, that could be the case. But what that would imply is that airlines have were making very substantial profits. Now, I don't think that that's really the case. So that, yes, there could be some markups and so on, and there is oligopoly in the market and so on and so forth. But whatever it's doing, it doesn't seem to be making airlines to be an incredibly profitable industry. So I don't think that effect is very strong.
May I just add? I mean, the aviation industry is a complex industry. It's not just the airlines. And some people, like, if I remember Ken Button correctly, for instance, he maybe say, oh, perhaps in particular with ATM, there is unions, and maybe the airlines are, having some problems with making good profits because the pilots earn too high salaries. So there are some surpluses, but they are not necessarily internalized by airlines. So I don't know, across the supply chain, I guess there are some who are making some benefit, making some profits. And
right. Well, I think, Peter, I think that's an interesting comment, Akim. We better keep moving on, though, if we're going to have time for Pieter Cornelisse to have a proper shot at being our lead discussant. It's good to see that in the discussion in the chat box that some of these issues are actually being developed, and Bill's been taking on the discussion on sustainable fuel. So Peter, and if you and Akim want to go onto the chat box to continue this exchange, you are very welcome to do it. And David Warnock, you'll have seen, put in a comment saying not his own view, but given that traffic is going to be reduced and emissions are going to be reduced for the next few years, then this is going to potentially take the pressure off governments for pushing for climate change. And I mean, that's the starting premise for this whole discussion. So Peter, at last, thank you very much for agreeing to be our lead discussant, and the floor is finally yours without a presentation. So go ahead.
Thank you, Stephen, for the introduction. Apologize that I don't have any slides, but I got this request quite late and I'm quite busy these days. So I'd like to do it orally along, let's say, 4 chapters. I'd like to react on some of the items of the other speakers as well, and I'd like to answer one of the questions in the chat box. The 4 chapters I'd like to go through is measures. The second is the market. The third one is our organization. And the fourth one is system, equipment, and airport charges. When it comes to measures, we as KLM, as many airlines, we have received support from the government. Support in terms of state aid, I don't like to call it aid, it's a loan. We've been given loans, and they need to be paid back within 5 years' time. And in order not to have it called state aid, the market interest is put on those loans. In return, we need to come up with a plan to restructure our organization, and also to come up with a plan in which we show that we are able to cut cost by some 15%. This all needs to be finished by October this year. So these are the conditions that are attached to the bailout. Another one is that our government sharpened the conditions or the aims that we already had put in place, also in negotiations with our government on the field of making aviation more sustainable. I'd like to mention a few. We agreed to have the carbon dioxide emissions to be halved by the year 2050. We agreed also to reduce the night movements at Schiphol Airport by 7,000 movements in the end. And also we continue with the initiative to come up with sustainable aviation fuel factory in the northern part of Holland, in which we as KLM invest together with Sky Energy and SHV Energy Company. So we strongly invest in sustainable aviation fuels because we believe that this is one of the effective ways to reduce the carbon dioxide. Now, when I look at the market, so the second chapter, what one of you addressed is ticket prices that will go up in the situation that we are now in and in the recovery period. I believe that this will be the case for a certain part of the market on the short term. So on the local market in Holland, you will see this phenomenon because we're not able to speed up the network in the same pace as the market demand goes. So for the short term, we indeed see some ticket price increases coming up. However, if we look at next winter, we requested, like many other airlines, to also have a slot waiver for coming winter in order to avoid that airlines and also KLM are putting too much capacity in the market in order to maintain their positions in slots. So we hope to hear within now in a week whether this will be approved or not. If this is granted, then we can better balance out the market demand versus what we put in the air in terms of capacity. Another thing is that I believe that one of you said that, Stephen, I think it was you, that the recovery will take more than 3 years. Well, it's very difficult to predict, especially when it regards the future. But we still believe that looking at other crises in history, that a recovery can be there in 3 years from now. I do have to say that that is the optimistic scenario. So 3 years to reach again the levels that we had in 2019. As KLM, this is where what we aim for, also in the recovery of our bank system, a 7-wave system. I will come back to that later on. At the same time, we see that aviation and economy are very strongly linked. Aviation, in my view, in terms of destinations that we offer and frequencies, are the infrastructure for our economy. So I believe it's always good to have these two in balance. When I look at the third chapter is organization. When I look into our own company, just a few examples. In order to, let's say, to run our operation, what we see in Europe is that we gradually come back again in Europe, and for the long haul flights, it still is cargo only, or it's mainly cargo that we do. So our cargo division is lacking good skills and employees at the moment. So what we did, we moved from other divisions people into the cargo division in order to boost the cargo traffic. So that is one example. We'd like to avoid irreversible decisions, for instance, by laying off employees that we need at the time that we are coming back to the old levels again. So we really put that in our heads, and we treat this very carefully. Then when I look at the fourth chapter, that is the system and the equipment. Looking at the 747, we had plans to phase out this aircraft by the end of next year. And now, because of COVID, we decided to get rid of this aircraft type sooner. So at the moment, there still is in the air a 747 Combi. I think this autumn will stop, and the aircraft will be taken out of operation. And in general, I see Airbus also decided to quit producing the A380. I saw a message from Boeing quitting with the 747. The era has passed now that we need 4-engined aircraft to operate transatlantic or Pacific stretches. So it's 2-engined aircraft for civil aviation as of now, I think. When it comes to airport charges, and then in particular landing and takeoff charges, one of you said, can't we just change that structure in order to incentivize airlines to change their fleet composition? I think this is a very minor thing. An airline like KLM is making its choices by the economics. So the aircraft economics, they drive the choices that we make, and also the government policy on the terrain of sustainability. That is what's driving our fleet choices. When it comes to carbon dioxide, CO2, there's a direct link to the burn of fuel, and we'd like to lower the burn of fuels, and in that sense we also reduce the carbon dioxide. And that brings me to the chat box, in which I saw a lot of interesting questions. One of them is Paul Peters, and he addressed a question on an Oxford report, which is to be published soon this year, and it shows that the report says that it shows that airline bailouts are the worst COVID recovery measure out of 25 groups of measures. Well, I read through this report, and it clearly states that bailouts are okay for as long as they are made very conditional, because and we agree on that. So for KLM, we have very strict. We have been given very strict measures on the terrain of sustainability, and we will continue with our initiatives on that terrain. When it comes to and I'd like to state again, the bailouts for KLM are loans, so we pay back every cent that we receive, and probably we will not use all the money. We only use the money that we need. The alternative, and that is my question, return question to Paul Peters, is what's the alternative? If you is the alternative that we should have all the airlines to go bankrupt? Is that the alternative? I don't think so. I think it will take decades to change an economy into another one to make money. And if I look in the Netherlands, we are very good at logistics and trading. So our economy is based on these two. And for hundreds of years, I think the Dutch are very good at this. And we need a main port as Schiphol, and also the harbor of Rotterdam and Amsterdam. We need those main ports to have our economy based on. So I can have a debate on measures when it comes to sustainability, and it should be, well, it should even be more stricter, perhaps. But our government recognized the following, and it is that aviation and a network as KLM has put in place, that is really essential for our economy. And they said, we don't want KLM to go bankrupt. So, and this is also what Oxford report states, the bailouts should be conditional. And I think for KLM, this is the case. So that is my reflection.
Thank you very much indeed, Pieter, and that was a very interesting reflection, and it's great to hear directly from how the market works. On this conditionality attached to bailouts, this brings us back to the modal shift conditions that were attached to Air France's loans. And there's been some speculation or some commentary in the press here in France, which maybe you can help us straighten out, which argues in two directions. There's suggestion that Air France won't be held to close down operations on lines that can be served by rail if it's part of their hubbing operation. So if they've got connecting flights on to long haul, and then on the other side, there is a suggestion that the European Union will allow France to restrict flights on routes by Air France, but not by other carriers registered in the European Union. So the effect could be to shut down Air France flights, which will just be then replaced by another airline that doesn't have a base that isn't registered in France itself. So, I mean, I didn't have the time to investigate and get to the bottom of those two comments on this particular condition. But your thoughts more generally on these measures to promote a forced modal shift to rail would be interesting to hear, even if you don't have specific insight on this commentary of the European Union regulation vis-a-vis how much you can intervene in this market.
Thank you, Stephen. Well, the point is, I can't reflect on the latter issue that you addressed. That other carriers can operate on routes domestically where France is obliged to quit operating. I can't recall this, to be honest, so I need to dive into this. On the other hand, when it comes to let's say the transition, the model shift from air to rail, I can say that we are busy working on this as well. When it comes to Brussels, for instance, we operate to Brussels 4 times a day, and we did this because the Belgian market is a very big market for KLM. Air France quit operating, ceased its operation at the start of this at the start of the century, so that is a long time ago, and we are about to do the same now. We are in talks with Thalys, for instance, and the Belgian government to have at least one train to be put in place of a frequency by the start of this winter, and that will be the first one. And soon, all flights will be taken out from Brussels, and we have this very good train offering 80 seats per stretch, and to have this connected in a keen way with Amsterdam. So we are working hard on this for 2 years now, but it's complex to have it properly in all systems. We also want this train to be blue, by the way. Well, that sounds silly, but we'd like to have a real good feeling for the passengers. As soon as they are on board a train, they need to have the feeling that they are on board of our aircraft. A seamless product, that's what we aim for. So, and this is the start. So we also look into other destinations, perhaps like Düsseldorf, perhaps London, to make the circle a little bit bigger. So, but it's a long term project, and France is having a lot of experience on this. So we learn a lot of our French colleagues.
Yeah, and you benefit from Schiphol having an excellent rail hub and policy that's shifted more to being an intermodal center rather than simply an airport. So you're in a relatively good position to achieve that. Bill, did you want to come back in on that point, because you were the one that originally raised this as an important conditionality?
I mean, we welcome that, and remember that there are no flights between Brussels and Charles de Gaulle, and we've had a TGV connection from Brussels Midi to Charles de Gaulle for a number of years, a good number of years now. It works very well. It's part of a TG train. It's a few carriages just reserved for passengers transiting over Charles de Gaulle. I don't think it's as I don't know, but I don't think it's as complicated as it needs to be. And certainly, I think implementation of 1008, 2008 in France, in Germany, in the Netherlands, certainly in Spain, where most of the high-speed trains have been paid for with European tax money. It's time to get that moving, and really doing this is not going to solve the modal shift problem, but it will start to really enable airlines and national rail companies to work out how code sharing should work. The main problem, as far as I can tell, is the baggage, because passengers still will have to check in as they do when they leave Brussels Midi at Charles de Gaulle. So let's use this period now before we go back to the status quo to start moving off. And I think once rail starts to move off, it will pick up pace, and I think that's important. The only other question, maybe not just to KLM, but to others, is what happens to those slots? If they end up going long haul, then the emissions actually go up very considerably.
Yeah, and I can see one of the problems for the airlines will be to get the rail operators to schedule the trains when they want them and not at a time that suits the rail operations, squeezing them into its other priorities and delivering the kind of reliability you need for interconnection for onward flights. So there's some headaches I can see in having to have a cooperative mode of a business rather than doing everything yourself.
Could I say, I know that the plans are very well advanced now for Salzburg, Vienna to be replaced by trains. There are 24 trains a day between Salzburg and Vienna, and the economics that I've seen suggest that those flights cost 12 million to run on an annual basis by Austrian, and they can save 8 million of that, and you have a much better frequency. And so let's get it going. There aren't many code shares at all, and let's just see what happens. But it's again, let's use the crisis and use this regulation, which is up for grabs. And that regulation also needs to have a hard look at public service obligations, because there's a clear push now to do more public service obligations, and we've got to make sure that taxpayers' money is well spent.
Yeah, and of course, the other aspect to all that is that the ideal would be a conventional train, not too high speed. The higher the speed, the more the emissions. But actually, Hans Martin had a broader question stimulated by Peter's comments. And Hans Martin, you also have power over the microphone, so why don't you intervene directly and take the mic?
Yes, I wonder what might be, so to say, the long-term view. I mean, I think we all agree that now it's not the time to increase any taxes, and even environmental taxes. But let's say we are after through the crisis, and isn't there a good rationale that we then have to increase taxes, because before we bailed out airlines and other industries? And so what's the best tax? And I think the best tax would be a kerosene tax, because you are doing something environmentally good. It's exactly what you should do in terms of the environment, and it also not hurting those which have been negatively affected most. These are the poor people. So in distributional perspectives, it's also perfect. So in 3, 4, 5 years, it's a perfect time for really strong and optimal environmentally pricing, and you take all the revenues to cover the deficits, and that's also distributional fair.
Yeah, I think you've got a good point there. It's going to take quite a bit of convincing government and industry that would be the solution. But I mean, the one thing to point out is not so much the aviation bailouts, at least the kind that KLM is using, because as Peter made very clear, these are loans that will be paid back. So in this time scale of 3 to 5 years, the government won't have a problem meeting those payments, but what it will have a problem meeting is supporting a very large number of unemployed that is likely to be generated from the type of intervention that we've been through. Peter, would you like to come back with a last remark as we're getting to the end of our time?
Is it to me or Pieter Forsyth?
No, Pieter Cornelisse, to you.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I understand the remark of Hans Martin very good, but the point is that only in Europe we do face, 27 different tax regimes, policies. So there are no countries with the same tax regime. So if you are going to put a tax in every country on the kerosene, you will have a distorted level playing field. So if you put a tax on this, you need to do this yeah, in such a way that level playing field is kept.
Yep, that brings us back to the hub of the difficulty of international negotiations on fiscal instruments. We need a uniform rate, but I think this is maybe where we need to focus our homework. Fuel tax could be back on the agenda, and let's use a crisis to try and see if that can be used rather than just put to the side because of existing practice. So we've used our hour and a half. So I would like to thank very much indeed our three speakers today, and Achim and Hans Martin for bringing us together in this series of GARS EAC online discussions. And just to remind you that there will be, the series will pick up again in September, so watch this space, and hopefully we will find each other, maybe even in a face-to-face meeting sometime in the second half of the year, but if not, online again in September. So thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.